Beneath our feet, the world holds secrets we have not yet finished understanding. There are entire cities carved into the rock, built not upward but downward, moving away from the surface and from sunlight, descending into the darkness of the earth for dozens of meters. Cities with streets and squares, with stables and cellars, with wells and ventilation systems, with churches and meeting halls, with kitchens and sleeping quarters. Cities capable of sheltering tens of thousands of people for months, completely self-sufficient beneath the surface, invisible from above, sealed from within by circular stones the size of a cartwheel that no external attacker could move. These cities exist. They are not legend or speculation. They are found in the region of Cappadocia, in the center of what is now Turkey, and more than 200 of them have been identified to date, though archaeologists believe many more remain undiscovered. The most famous and the deepest explored so far is called Derinkuyu, a Turkish name that simply means deep well. When archaeologists began systematically excavating its galleries in the second half of the 20th century, what they found left them speechless. 18 levels carved into volcanic rock, descending more than 80 meters below the surface, with capacity to shelter between 20 and 50,000 people according to estimates, along with their domestic animals and their provisions for months of isolation. Tonight we are going to descend together into those cities. We are going to explore what we know about who built them, when and why. We are going to walk their galleries and their chambers, imagine the life that unfolded in them for generations, and contemplate the questions that still have no answer. Because the underground cities of Cappadocia are one of those places where archaeology and mystery meet in a way that is difficult to forget. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, this is a good moment to do so. Every week we explore a different world with a calm narration designed to accompany your rest. The first excavations into the volcanic tuff of Cappadocia probably began in the Bronze Age, more than 4,000 years ago, as simple refuges and storage rooms carved into the hillsides. But over time, those excavations became deeper, more elaborate, more complex, until they became the underground cities that archaeologists have explored in recent centuries. The process was not the result of a single deliberate plan, but of generations of inhabitants who added levels, galleries, and rooms over centuries or even millennia of continued use and changing needs. Understanding the underground cities as the work of many generations rather than a single project changes how we see them. They are not monuments to a single moment of ambition, but records of a sustained and adaptive relationship between communities and their geological environment. The thermal properties of the underground cities were also exploited for food preservation as well as human comfort. The constant temperature of around 13 degrees Celsius that prevails in the deeper levels of Derinkuyu is close to the ideal storage temperature for wine, olive oil, dried fruits, and many of the other preserved foods that formed the basis of the ancient Cappadocian diet. The deepest storage rooms of the underground cities would have functioned as natural refrigerators, maintaining the quality of stored provisions far longer than would have been possible in surface storage facilities exposed to the wide temperature swings of the Cappadocian climate. That food preservation function may have been as important to the communities that built the underground cities as the defensive refuge function, particularly in years when harvest failures made the contents of those deep cellars literally the difference between survival and starvation. The region of Cappadocia has a geology that made these cities possible. About 9 million years ago, two volcanoes in the region, Erciyes Dağ and Hasan Dağ, erupted catastrophically, covering the landscape with enormous layers of volcanic ash that over time solidified into a rock called tuff or ignimbrite. This rock is extraordinarily easy to work when freshly extracted from the earth. Soft as cheese, it can be cut with simple tools of wood, bone, or metal without difficulty. But in contact with air, it hardens rapidly, reaching a considerable resistance that makes it perfect for building permanent structures. The inhabitants of the region discovered this thousands of years ago and began excavating into it with a determination and a skill that is still astonishing today. The Cappadocian landscape above ground also bears the marks of the same communities that built the underground cities. The valleys of the region are lined with rock-cut churches, monasteries, and cave dwellings that represent the surface expression of the same culture that built Derinkuyu below. Those surface rock-cut structures, carved into the same soft tuff as the underground cities, range from simple single-room dwellings to elaborate multi-room complexes with carved facades, interior columns, and elaborate decorative programs in fresco. The largest concentration of these surface cave complexes is found in the Gorim Valley, where hundreds of carved structures create a landscape that is simultaneously prehistoric in its origins and extraordinarily sophisticated in its execution. Understanding the underground cities in isolation from this broader landscape of rock-cut architecture gives an incomplete picture of what was fundamentally a comprehensive adaptation of an entire culture to the peculiar geological opportunities of their homeland. The tuff of Cappadocia has an additional property that makes it especially suitable for underground construction: its porosity. The rock is filled with small pores that allow water vapor to pass through it slowly, which means that the excavated galleries do not become damp and suffocating as would occur in a natural cave in impermeable rock. The exchange of water vapor through the porous walls helps maintain the relative humidity of the interior at levels that, while higher than those of the arid Cappadocian exterior, are low enough that the environment is breathable and not conducive to the growth of fungi and bacteria in quantities that would represent a health risk for the occupants. Descending into Derinkuyu today, following a guide through the narrow passages that archaeologists have prepared for visitors, is an experience that challenges the expectations of anyone who has not been in a similar place before. The first surprise is the temperature. Just a few meters below the surface, the air temperature stabilizes at around 13 or 14 degrees Celsius, regardless of the season. Outside, Cappadocia can reach 40 degrees in summer and several degrees below zero in winter. Underground, those fluctuations disappear completely. The rock acts as a natural thermostat, maintaining the interior at a temperature that feels cool in summer and relatively warm in winter compared with the outside. For a population that lived without central heating or refrigeration, that thermal stability was an incalculable luxury. The underground cities of Cappadocia also demonstrate that the impulse to create permanent structures is not driven only by prosperity and security, but equally by vulnerability and threat. Some of the most impressive architectural achievements in human history were created by communities under extreme pressure, whose survival depended on their ability to solve engineering problems that no one had solved before. The aqueducts of ancient Rome, the fortifications of medieval Europe, the irrigation systems of ancient Mesopotamia, and the underground cities of Cappadocia all share this characteristic. They were built not in conditions of ease but in conditions of necessity, by communities that had no other good options and who channeled their collective intelligence and labor into solutions that would last for millennia. The ventilation systems of Derinkuyu did not only serve to renew the air. They also functioned as temperature regulators and heat distribution systems for the warmth generated by the occupants and their animals. In winter, the body heat of thousands of people and their domestic animals accumulated in the most enclosed spaces of the city, and the ventilation shafts controlled its distribution so that the inhabited areas maintained a comfortable temperature without becoming excessively hot. In summer, the circulation of cool air from the deeper zones of the city toward the surface, driven by the temperature difference between interior and exterior, created a natural cooling current that kept the interior at a notably lower temperature than the scorching Cappadocian summer above. The Hittites, who dominated the region during the second millennium before our era, are the most frequently mentioned candidates for the role of original builders in popular archaeological literature, but the evidence is ambiguous. There are Hittite texts that mention underground cities, and some archaeologists have identified architectural characteristics in the oldest parts of Derinkuyu and other cities that are consistent with Hittite construction techniques. But no unequivocally Hittite inscription or artifact has been found in the underground cities in quantities that would allow them to be attributed with certainty. The question of who first began to transform simple storage rooms into the complex multi-level cities we see today remains genuinely open, which is part of what makes them so compelling. The question of how light was managed underground deserves more attention than it usually receives in accounts of the Cappadocian cities. Oil lamps of the type used in the ancient Mediterranean world burn a relatively small quantity of oil per hour, producing a flame roughly equivalent to a modern candle. A city housing tens of thousands of people for months would require an enormous quantity of lamp oil simply to provide minimal lighting in the main passages and communal areas. The storage of lamp oil must therefore have been one of the primary logistical concerns of the communities that prepared for underground refuge, alongside the storage of food and water. The distribution of lamp oil during a period of confinement, deciding how much each family could use and ensuring that communal areas maintained adequate lighting, would have required the kind of centralized resource management that implies a relatively sophisticated social organization. The second surprise is the air. Despite being dozens of meters below the surface, the air in Derinkuyu is fresh and breathable. This is due to one of the most impressive engineering achievements of the underground cities: the ventilation system. The builders of Derinkuyu excavated more than 50 vertical ventilation shafts connecting the lower levels with the surface, distributed throughout the extent of the city so that air circulates continuously between them. Some of those shafts also served as water sources, connecting with the underground water table. The combination of natural ventilation and access to groundwater made a relatively comfortable life possible under conditions that would otherwise have been unbearable. The third surprise is the scale. The plans of Derinkuyu, in which archaeologists have represented the known galleries and chambers, resemble those of a modern city seen from above, with its network of main and secondary streets, its squares, and its buildings. But instead of extending horizontally across the surface, all that complexity extends vertically downward. The uppermost level, closest to the surface, contains stables where domestic animals were housed during periods of refuge. The intermediate levels contain the residential areas, with rooms that archaeologists interpret as sleeping quarters, dining areas, and kitchens. The deepest levels contain the cellars where food and wine were stored, and the cisterns where water was collected. And somewhere in the deepest levels, archaeologists have identified a room that by its dimensions and arrangement they interpret as a school or community meeting place. The maintenance of the underground cities during the centuries of their active use would have required ongoing labor investment from the communities that depended on them. The soft tuff that made excavation easy also required periodic maintenance. Passages that developed cracks from the settling of the rock above needed to be repaired or reinforced, ventilation shafts that became blocked with debris needed to be cleared, and water channels that silted up needed to be cleaned out. That maintenance labor, which was not dramatic or heroic but was essential to the continued functioning of the system, represents another form of transgenerational investment that the communities of Cappadocia sustained across centuries of changing political circumstances. The distribution of water sources in Derinkuyu also reflects careful planning. The wells connecting with the water table are not randomly distributed throughout the city, but strategically located at points that allow access from multiple residential areas without creating bottlenecks that could become points of conflict when the entire population was using the city simultaneously. That deliberate distribution of water resources suggests that the builders thought not only about the physical structure of the city but also about the social dynamics of its use under pressure, anticipating the problems that competition for scarce resources could generate in a confined space. The fourth surprise, and perhaps the most striking, are the ceiling stones. At several points in the main galleries of Derinkuyu, the builders installed closing mechanisms consisting of enormous circular stones, between 1 and 2 meters in diameter and weighing between 500 kilograms and a ton, that could be rolled from the inside to completely block the passage. Once closed, those stones are practically impossible to move from the outside. They are designed so that the pressure exerted from outside keeps them firmly in place, while from the inside they can be moved with relative ease through a system of levers and the slope of the floor. They are, in essence, assault-proof doors, designed specifically to protect the city's inhabitants against an army attempting to enter by force. The history of Cappadocia is the history of a crossroads. One of the most fascinating questions about the underground cities of Cappadocia is how social life was organized inside them during periods of refuge. When an entire community, perhaps several thousand people, descended underground and sealed the entrances, how did they organize the space? Who decided who occupied which part of the city? How were food and water distributed? How was order and social cohesion maintained during weeks or months of confinement in a dark, damp, and crowded space? The historical sources do not answer these questions directly, and archaeologists can only make inferences from the physical arrangement of the spaces. What does seem clear is that the underground cities had a hierarchical structure, with some areas clearly more privileged than others in terms of space, ventilation, and access to water. The underground cities also provide evidence of craft production during periods of confinement. Some of the chambers in Derinquiu and other cities appear to have been used as workshops, with evidence of textile production, pottery making, and other craft activities. That evidence suggests that the communities did not simply wait passively for the danger to pass but organized productive work during the confinement period, both to maintain morale and to produce goods that would be needed when they returned to the surface. The presence of craft workshops underground also implies that the communities brought not just food and animals with them when they descended, but also the tools and raw materials needed to continue productive activity. The region lies in the heart of Anatolia, the peninsula that today occupies most of modern Turkey, and over the centuries it has been crossed, conquered, and inhabited by an extraordinary succession of peoples and civilizations. The Hittites established their capital not far from here more than 3,500 years ago. The Persians incorporated it into their empire. Alexander the Great conquered it on his march eastward. The Romans made it a province. The Arabs attacked it repeatedly during the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries of our era. The Seljuk Turks conquered it in the 11th century. The Mongols sacked it in the 13th. The Ottomans incorporated it into their empire in the 15th. Each of those shifts of power left the local populations exposed to periods of violence and instability that made the possibility of sheltering underground for weeks or months literally a matter of survival. The carbon dating of organic materials found in the underground cities, including charred grain, animal bones, and fragments of wooden tools and containers, has provided some of the most reliable chronological anchors for the history of their use. Those dates confirm that the cities were in active use during the periods of Byzantine rule in the region, from the 4th to the 11th centuries of our era, and that some areas show evidence of use dating back to the Late Bronze Age. The gaps in the chronological record, periods when the dating evidence suggests the cities were not heavily used, may correspond to periods of relative stability when the communities did not need to take refuge underground, or they may simply reflect gaps in the preservation of organic materials that would otherwise provide dates. The Arabic medieval texts that describe raids into Anatolia occasionally mention the frustration of military commanders faced with the complete disappearance of local populations who, unlike in other regions, could not be found to be enslaved or ransomed. Those texts rarely explain where the populations had gone, but modern historians interpret those disappearances as episodes of mass underground refuge. An army arriving at a Cappadocian village could find the houses empty, no trace of the inhabitants, no animals in the stables, no food in the granaries. For an Arab commander of the 8th century, that disappearance must have been incomprehensible and disturbing, a psychological effect that the inhabitants of Cappadocia probably appreciated as much as the physical refuge the underground cities provided. The water management infrastructure of Derinquiu extended beyond the ventilation shafts that doubled as wells. Archaeological investigation has also identified channels carved into the floors of some galleries that directed water flow toward collection points, a system that would have been important for managing the condensation that forms on the cooler rock surfaces in the lower levels during warm weather. That condensation, which drips from the ceiling and runs down the walls in the deeper parts of the underground city, can accumulate in significant quantities and would need to be directed away from living and storage areas to prevent the soaking of stored provisions and the development of dangerously slippery floor surfaces. The oldest written texts that mention the use of the underground cities of Cappadocia date from the 4th century of our era, when the Greek writer Xenophon, in his work The Anabasis, describes how the populations of the region lived in houses carved into the rock, with entrance openings as narrow as those of a well that were descended by ladders, with stables for animals underground. Xenophon was describing what were probably more primitive versions of the cities that would reach their maximum development centuries later, but his testimony confirms that the practice of living partially or totally underground had a long history in the region before the great underground building projects of the Christian era. The experience of the archaeologists who first systematically explored the underground cities in the 1960s and 1970s was in some ways comparable to the experience of the original inhabitants during periods of refuge. The darkness, the narrow passages, the sense of being surrounded by rock on all sides, the dependence on artificial light, the difficulty of orienting oneself without the visual cues of the sky and horizon. Those archaeologists brought electric torches rather than oil lamps, and they were exploring rather than hiding, but the physical experience of the spaces was similar enough that several of them have written about how the environment changed their perception of what the original inhabitants must have felt. That empathetic dimension of archaeological fieldwork, the bodily understanding that comes from moving through the same spaces as the people being studied, is one of the aspects of the discipline that cannot be fully communicated through reports and measurements. It is during the centuries of Arab expansion, between the 7th and 10th centuries of our era, that historians believe the underground cities of Cappadocia reached their maximum development and their most intensive use. Arab incursions into Anatolia were frequent, rapid and devastating for local populations. An Arab army could appear on the horizon with only a few days of warning, loot the surface villages and disappear before any relief could arrive. In those circumstances, the ability to bring an entire village's population underground within a few hours, taking with them the domestic animals, the provisions and the valuables, and to seal the entrances from within with the enormous circular stones, was a tactical advantage of the first order. Derinkuyu is not the only underground city of Cappadocia, nor even the largest in terms of horizontal extent. About 9 kilometers away, the city of Kaymakli has an equally impressive layout, though its tunnels extend more laterally than vertically. And most extraordinarily, archaeologists have discovered that Derinkuyu and Kaymakli were originally connected to each other by a subterranean tunnel of almost 10 kilometers in length, which would have allowed the movement of people and possibly animals between the two cities without the need to surface. That tunnel has been partially explored but is not fully open to the public, and archaeologists estimate that significant extensions of the underground system of the region remain unmapped. The processing of food and the management of cooking fires underground would have presented particular challenges that the builders addressed in the design of the cities. Cooking produces both heat and carbon monoxide, the latter particularly dangerous in enclosed spaces. The evidence of cooking areas in the underground cities, identified through traces of soot and the presence of stone platforms that served as hearths, shows that they were located near ventilation shafts that would carry away the smoke and combustion gases. The management of fire underground, balancing the need for cooked food with the risk of carbon monoxide buildup and the consumption of limited lamp oil, was one of the practical knowledge systems that communities had to develop and transmit across generations. The relationship between the underground cities and water management on the surface is also worth exploring. The ventilation shafts of Derinkuyu, which number more than 50, were carefully positioned to avoid connecting with the underground drainage channels that carried rainwater away from the surface settlements. If those ventilation shafts had been placed where surface water could flow down them during heavy rain, the lower levels of the city would have flooded catastrophically. The positioning of the ventilation shafts, therefore, required a detailed understanding of the surface hydrology of the area above the city, another dimension of the sophisticated spatial knowledge that the builders brought to their engineering project. The other underground cities of Cappadocia show a diversity of designs and scales that suggests they were not all built by the same group, in the same period, or for the same purpose. Some are relatively small, with just 2 or 3 levels and capacity for a few hundred people. Others are of a scale comparable to Derinquiu. Some have clearly religious architectural features, with rooms that archaeologists interpret as churches or baptistries carved directly into the rock. Others appear to have been primarily storage and refuge facilities with no apparent religious function. The city of Volcanic, discovered in 1972, adds another fascinating element to the catalogue of defensive engineering of the Cappadocian cities. In addition to the usual ceiling stones, Volcanic has a system of small holes drilled through the stone doors that archaeologists interpret as loopholes, openings small enough to insert a spear or arrow toward the outside, but too small for an attacker to see clearly what was on the other side. Those small design details, which required as much thought as the larger structures of the cities, reveal that the builders were people with direct experience of siege situations who designed their defenses from that practical knowledge. The geographic distribution of the underground cities is also informative. They are concentrated mainly in a relatively compact area of central Cappadocia, around the modern towns of Nevşehir, Nigda, and their surroundings. That concentration coincides with the zone where the volcanic tuff is softest and easiest to work, suggesting that local geology was a determining factor in the choice of locations. But it also coincides with the zone that was historically most vulnerable to incursions from the east and southeast, the direction from which waves of Persian, Arab, and later Turkish invaders arrived. The underground cities also illuminate a general principle about the relationship between engineering and culture. The most impressive engineering achievements are not those that push the limits of available materials and technology, but those that solve the right problems with the available materials and technology. The builders of Derinquiu did not need to develop new materials or new tools to create their underground city. They needed to understand the properties of the material they had, to develop organizational structures capable of coordinating sustained collective effort, and to think carefully about the problems they needed to solve. That combination of material knowledge, social organization, and clear problem definition is the essence of engineering in any era, and the underground cities demonstrate it as clearly as any structure in the ancient world. The underground cities of Cappadocia are not the only ones of their kind in the world, though they are the best known and the most extensive explored to date. The international scholarly community that studies the underground cities of Cappadocia includes geologists, archaeologists, historians, architectural historians, conservation scientists, and geophysicists, reflecting the interdisciplinary nature of the questions that the sites raise. No single discipline has all the tools needed to understand these complex sites, and the most productive research programs have been those that combine geological analysis of the rock formation with archaeological study of the human modifications, historical research into the textual sources that document their use, and conservation science that can advise on how to preserve the structures while allowing continued access for research and tourism. That interdisciplinary model, developed in response to the complexity of the underground cities, has become a template for the study of other complex cultural heritage sites around the world. The underground cities also have implications for our understanding of ancient population dynamics in Cappadocia. The capacity of Derinquiu alone to shelter between 20 and 50,000 people implies that the surrounding region had a population of that scale at the time of the city's maximum use. When combined with the populations implied by the other known underground cities in the region, the total underground shelter capacity of Cappadocia suggests a regional population in the early medieval period that may have been larger than is sometimes assumed based on surface archaeological evidence alone. Underground cities, by their nature, leave a different kind of archaeological footprint than surface settlements. and the underground evidence may need to be incorporated into broader population reconstructions for the region. In northern India, in the region of Rajasthan, systems of steps and tunnels carved into rock served as access to underground aquifers but also included rest and meeting rooms several floors below the surface. In Iran, the ancient cities of Nushabad and Sayman include extensive tunnel systems that would have served as refuge during the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. In Ethiopia, the city of Lalibela has its famous rock-carved churches, not exactly underground but carved downward from ground level so that they are completely surrounded by rock on their lower three quarters. In Malta, the temples of the Neolithic period include underground chambers of obscure purpose. And beneath the city of Naples in Italy, there is a labyrinth of tunnels and caverns excavated over more than 2,000 years of continuous history that at various moments served as shelter for the entire population of the city. The underground cities also functioned as economic nodes during the periods between invasions. The storage rooms that archaeologists have identified, with their carved niches and platforms for large ceramic jars, represent significant investments in agricultural surplus management. A community that could store months of food supplies underground was a community that could survive not just raids but prolonged disruptions to normal agricultural activity. The underground storage system effectively extended the time horizon of economic planning for the Cappadocian communities, allowing them to think in terms of years rather than months when managing their food security. The administrative infrastructure required to manage an underground city during a period of confinement would have been substantial. Decisions about the use of communal resources, the resolution of disputes between families competing for space or water access, the organization of defensive watches at the sealed entrances, the management of sanitation in a city housing tens of thousands of people. All of these functions required recognized authority and established procedures. The underground cities were not just engineering projects but social projects, requiring the development of governance mechanisms capable of maintaining order and cooperation in extraordinarily challenging conditions. The existence of those mechanisms, which the archaeological record documents only indirectly, is one of the most remarkable aspects of the underground city phenomenon. The Christian era added an additional dimension to the underground cities of Cappadocia. From the 4th century of our era onward, the region became one of the most important centers of early Christianity in Asia Minor. The early Christians, who in many periods of the Roman Empire were persecuted or simply lived on the margins of official society, found in the underground cities of Cappadocia a refuge where they could practice their faith with relative freedom. The evidence of Christian use of the underground cities is abundant. Crosses carved into the walls of the galleries, rooms that archaeologists interpret as chapels or baptistries, and in some cases paintings on the walls depicting biblical scenes, though in worse condition of preservation than the famous frescoes of the rock-cut churches on the surface. The churches and chapels carved into the underground cities present architectural characteristics that archaeologists have been able to date with greater precision than the residential galleries or the stables, because the architectural and decorative styles of early Christian art are relatively well documented. The oldest of those underground chapels appear to date from the 4th or 5th century of our era, confirming that the cities were being actively expanded and remodeled during the period of early Christianity in the region. The frescoes of some of those chapels, though in many cases in fragmentary condition, show an artistic quality suggesting that the artists who painted them were professionals, not simply inhabitants decorating their refuge in an improvised manner. The Cappadocian Fathers, a group of 4th century theologians including figures as influential as Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus, lived and wrote in this region during the period when the underground cities were at one of their most intensive moments of use. Although none of them explicitly mentions having lived underground, it is probable that they knew the underground cities firsthand and that their communities used them as refuge in moments of tension. The idea that some of the most influential theological reflections of early Christianity might have been elaborated underground, in the silence of the galleries carved into the volcanic tuff of Cappadocia, has something poetic about it that is difficult to ignore. The archaeologists working in Cappadocia have the certainty that the most important discoveries are still to be made. In 2014, during demolition works on a building in the center of the city of Nevşehir, workers discovered the entrance to an unknown underground system that subsequent excavations have revealed as potentially larger than Derinkuyu. The Nevşehir complex, which has been systematically explored since then, extends beneath a surface area of approximately 4 square kilometers and appears to include galleries, chambers and structures of still undetermined function that archaeologists hope will, when fully excavated and studied, rewrite some of the current assumptions about the scale and complexity of the Cappadocian underground project. The Turkish government's decision to designate the Gorim National Park and the rock sites of Cappadocia as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1985 reflects an international consensus about the exceptional value of these sites for humanity as a whole. That designation brings both benefits and obligations. Increased international attention and funding for conservation, but also increased pressure from tourism and increased scrutiny of management decisions. The Turkish authorities responsible for the management of the underground cities have to balance the interests of the local communities who live and work in the region, the interests of the hundreds of thousands of tourists who visit each year, the interests of the researchers who need access for scientific study, and the interests of future generations who have not yet had the chance to form their own relationship with these extraordinary places. That balancing act, which is never perfectly achieved, is the practical expression of the concept of shared global heritage. The engineering of the deepest levels of Derinkuyu also involved solutions to the problem of structural stability at great depth. Volcanic tuff, while relatively soft and easy to excavate, can fracture under the weight of the rock above if cavities are made too large or if the supporting pillars between chambers are too narrow. The builders of Derinkuyu developed empirical rules for the dimensions of chambers and the thickness of supporting pillars that kept the structure stable even at 80 meters of depth. Those rules were not derived from theoretical engineering but from generations of trial and observation, including presumably the catastrophic failures that taught early builders where the limits of the material lay. The geological surveys conducted in recent years around Derinkuyu have revealed that the underground city extends significantly further than the portions currently open to visitors. The areas accessible to tourists represent perhaps a third of the total known extent of the city, and the known extent represents an uncertain fraction of the total actual extent. Archaeologists working with ground-penetrating radar have identified numerous anomalies beneath the surrounding landscape that are consistent with unfilled underground chambers, passages, and shafts similar to those already known. Some of those anomalies are located beneath privately owned land and urban infrastructure that makes excavation difficult or impossible without major disruption. The full extent of Derinkuyu may not be known for generations, and when it is finally mapped completely, the city may prove to be significantly larger than current estimates suggest. That accidental discovery, the result of routine urban demolition works, perfectly illustrates the current state of the archaeology of underground cities. Beneath the streets and buildings of the modern cities of Cappadocia, there are enormous stretches of underground territory that have not yet been explored or mapped. Every time construction works of any depth are carried out in the region, there is the possibility of finding entrances to unknown galleries. And since most of the subsoil of the region has not been systematically surveyed with geophysical methods, archaeologists do not yet have a complete picture of the total extent of the underground system. The experience of preparing for underground refuge would have been one of the defining rhythms of life for the communities that depended on the cities of Cappadocia. When reports arrived of an approaching army, the entire community would mobilize to bring the necessities of life underground. The grain from the surface granaries, the animals from the surface stables, the valuables from the houses, the tools needed for the weeks ahead. That mobilization would have required prior planning and rehearsal, a maintained state of readiness that was itself a significant social institution. Communities that regularly practiced the underground retreat would have developed efficient procedures for the rapid transfer of a village's entire productive capacity below ground, with assigned roles for every person, designated routes for moving animals, and predetermined storage locations for every category of supply. Modern non-invasive exploration techniques are beginning to change that situation. Ground-penetrating radar systems, which send radar pulses into the soil and analyze the reflections to detect cavities and underground structures without the need for excavation, have been used in some parts of Cappadocia with promising results. Electrical resistivity tomography systems, which measure variations in the electrical conductivity of the soil to detect variations in its composition, have also identified possible underground structures in areas not yet explored. And aerial photogrammetry with drones, which can detect subtle variations in surface vegetation caused by underground cavities, has added a new tool to the archaeologists' arsenal. The debates about how to manage the underground heritage of Cappadocia reflect broader debates about the relationship between knowledge and its preservation. Fully excavating the Nevser complex would allow archaeologists to obtain invaluable information about the history and function of that system. But excavation also destroys the archaeological context irreversibly. Every time an archaeologist removes an artifact from the earth, that artifact is no longer in its original context and can never return to it. Modern techniques allow that context to be documented with unprecedented fidelity, but documentation is not the same as preserving the object in its original place. The role of the underground cities in the local economy of Cappadocia during the Byzantine period was not limited to their function as refuges. The deep storage rooms of the cities appear to have been used for the aging of wine, a practice that requires the stable, cool temperatures that the underground provides and that cannot easily be replicated in surface storage facilities in a climate as variable as that of central Anatolia. The wine produced in the vineyards of Cappadocia, which was known in the Byzantine world for its quality, may have owed part of its reputation to the underground aging that the cities made possible, a connection between the subterranean infrastructure and the agricultural economy of the region that is rarely mentioned in accounts focused on the defensive function of the underground cities. The preservation of the underground cities also raises the question of for whom they are preserved. For the tourists who visit them today? For the archaeologists who study them? For future generations not yet born? For the local communities that live above them and whose cultural identity is tied to their existence? Those questions have no simple answers, and debates about the management of the underground heritage of Cappadocia reflect broader tensions about the meaning of cultural heritage and about who has the authority to decide how it is conserved and used. What does it tell us about ourselves that human beings have sought refuge underground at so many moments and in so many different places in their history? The connection between the underground cities and the surface landscape of Cappadocia is more intimate than it might appear. The same geological processes that created the soft tuff that made underground excavation easy also created the famous fairy chimney rock formations that make the Cappadocian surface landscape so distinctive. Those tall, narrow spires of harder rock capped by darker basalt were formed by the differential erosion of harder and softer layers of volcanic material, the same layer geology that the underground city builders exploited when choosing where to excavate. The surface and underground landscapes of Cappadocia are different expressions of the same geological history, and understanding one helps to understand the other. The underground cities of Cappadocia also invite reflection on the concept of home in its most fundamental sense. What makes a place home is not primarily its physical characteristics but the relationships and the history that have accumulated in it over time. The families that descended into Derinquiu during a raid in the 8th century knew every corner of those underground spaces with the intimacy of long familiarity. The particular smell of the storage room where the family's olive oil was kept, the sound that the ventilation shaft made when the wind blew from the north, the exact amount of pressure needed to move the ceiling stone that protected their section of the gallery. That embodied familiarity, built up through repeated experience over generations, transformed what would otherwise be simply a dark hole in the ground into a home, a place of belonging and safety, a space saturated with the accumulated history of the family and the community. The underground cities of Cappadocia also raise interesting questions about the relationship between memory and landscape. For the communities that use them regularly, the underground cities were not mysterious archaeological sites but familiar, intimate spaces that they knew in the same way that we know our own homes. They knew which passage led to the water, which room had the best ventilation, where the ceiling stones were positioned and how to operate them, where the animals should be stabled to minimize smell and noise. That intimate practical knowledge, accumulated through repeated use and transmitted through oral tradition and direct experience, constituted a form of spatial memory that was as important to the survival of the community as any physical characteristic of the cities themselves. The most immediate answer is also the most obvious. When the surface becomes dangerous, going downward is an instinctive response. Animals that live in burrows do so for exactly the same reason. The earth is opaque to the gaze and to the weapons of enemies. Burying oneself beneath it is to become invisible, inaccessible, safe. That logic is universal and requires no cultural sophistication to understand. But the underground cities of Cappadocia go far beyond that basic logic. They are not improvised burrows but engineering works elaborated over generations, requiring long-term planning, complex social organization and an enormous investment of collective labor. The simple act of excavating the more than 50 ventilation shafts of Derinquiu, coordinating their position to create a functional air circulation system, implies a level of understanding of fluid dynamics and spatial planning that cannot be acquired spontaneously. Someone had to think about it, design it, direct its construction, and transmit the necessary knowledge to maintain it over time. The architecture of the underground cities also reflects a sophisticated understanding of the psychology of fear and confinement. The narrowest passages of Derinquiu, which force current visitors to advance crouching and in single file, are not a design flaw but a deliberate feature. A narrow passage can be defended by a single person against many attackers, while a wide passage allows several attackers to advance simultaneously. The arrangement of the stone doors, which can only be operated from the inside, reflects the same logic. It is about maximizing the defensive advantage of the inhabitants over the attackers, making the narrowness and darkness of the space, which would be disadvantages in any other context, into tactical advantages. At the same time, the underground cities had to be habitable for their occupants for extended periods. A refuge that protected its inhabitants from external enemies but killed them with claustrophobia, carbon dioxide intoxication, or dehydration would have been useless. The balance between defensive security and habitability is the central problem that the builders of Derinquiu and the other underground cities had to solve, and the sophistication with which they solved it, through the design of ventilation systems, access to groundwater and the organization of space into differentiated functional areas, is one of the most impressive testimonies to human practical intelligence that antiquity has left us. The question of what life was like inside the underground cities during periods of refuge is one that archaeology can only illuminate indirectly, through the interpretation of spaces and objects found in them. The rooms interpreted as schools or places of instruction, which appear in several of the larger cities, suggest that the period of confinement was not understood simply as a time of passive waiting, but as an opportunity for education and the transmission of knowledge. Children who grew up in communities that regularly used the underground cities must have learned from a young age how to function in that environment. How to move in narrow passages, how to conserve lamp oil, how to behave in communal spaces in ways that did not generate conflict under crowded conditions. The spiritual life of the underground communities during periods of refuge is one of the aspects of the underground city story that is most difficult to access through the archaeological record, but also one of the most humanly significant. The presence of chapels and prayer spaces in the underground cities suggests that the communities maintained their religious practices during confinement, which would have provided both comfort and a framework of meaning for an experience that might otherwise have been experienced as pure terror and helplessness. The prayers offered in those underground chapels, The rituals performed in the darkness beneath the earth while an army moved across the surface above represent a form of spiritual resistance to the dehumanizing conditions of violent threat that is one of the most characteristic expressions of human dignity under pressure. The modern scientific study of the underground cities has been transformed by the availability of three-dimensional mapping technology. Laser scanning systems, which create millimeter-accurate three-dimensional models of underground spaces without the need for physical contact, have been used in Derinkuyu and other cities to produce digital records of the carved surfaces that capture every tool mark, every worn edge, every structural modification made over millennia of use. Those digital models are not just scientific records but insurance policies. If the physical structures are ever damaged by earthquake, flood, or deterioration, the digital models preserve the geometry of the spaces in a form that future researchers and conservators can use. The experience of hearing the underground cities described by the elderly inhabitants of Cappadocian villages in the mid-20th century, before those memories faded with the passing of the last generation to have personal contact with the tradition of underground refuge, was one of the formative experiences for the archaeologists who began the systematic study of Derinkuyu and other cities in the 1960s and 1970s. Those oral accounts, collected by researchers before they were lost forever, provided context for the archaeological findings that purely physical evidence could not have supplied. The names of different parts of the city, the rules for their use during confinement, the stories of particular refuge episodes that had passed into local legend. That dialogue between oral tradition and physical archaeology is one of the most productive methodologies available for understanding sites that were used by communities whose daily lives left few written records. The legacy of the underground cities in the collective memory of the communities that used them can still be felt in the cultural life of the Cappadocian region today. Local festivals, folk tales, and artistic traditions all make reference to the underground world beneath the surface, treating it not as a historical curiosity but as an ongoing presence in the landscape and in the imagination of the people who live above it. That living relationship between a community and its buried past is increasingly rare in the modern world, where the pace of change often severs the connections between present inhabitants and the long history of the places they occupy. In Cappadocia, those connections remain unusually strong, partly because the underground cities are physically present and accessible in ways that most ancient heritage is not. There is a dimension of the underground cities of Cappadocia that is rarely mentioned in tourist guides but deserves to be contemplated: the experience of actually living in them. Not the one-hour visit that current tourists make, following a guide through electrically lit passages with a phone in hand for photographs, but the real experience of descending underground with the entire family, the animals and the provisions, sealing the entrance with a circular stone, and knowing that you would not surface until the danger had passed, which could be days, weeks, or even months. The darkness would be the first thing. Not the relative darkness of a windowless room, but the absolute darkness of a place where no trace of natural light reaches. The oil lamps and torches of the underground city's inhabitants would provide enough light to move around and for basic tasks, but would also consume the oxygen of the more enclosed spaces and produce smoke that would make the air unbreathable in areas with poor ventilation. The inhabitants of Derinkuyu knew perfectly which parts of the city could be lit without problems and which required more caution, knowledge acquired over generations of use. The noise would be the second most striking thing. On the surface, silence is never absolute. There is always wind, birds, the sound of vegetation, the distant noise of human activities. Underground, all those sounds disappear. What remains is the sound of the occupants themselves. Voices, footsteps, the movement of animals, the crying of children. In a space full of people under stress, that acoustic environment could be both reassuring, the sound of the community united against danger, and oppressive, the impossibility of finding a moment of silence or privacy. The geological instability of the Cappadocia region, which is located in a seismically active zone, adds another dimension to the engineering achievement of the underground cities. Earthquakes are a recurring feature of the regional environment, and the underground structures have survived multiple seismic events over their 2,000-year history. The key to that survival is the geometry of the excavated spaces. The arched ceilings and the careful spacing of supporting pillars distribute the forces generated by seismic waves in ways that prevent catastrophic collapse, even when the rock around the chambers is moving. Modern structural engineers who have studied the geometry of the Derinkuyu chambers have noted that the builders, working entirely from empirical experience rather than theoretical structural analysis, arrived at design solutions that are remarkably close to what modern engineering would prescribe for earthquake-resistant underground construction. The sense of time would change underground. Without cycles of light and darkness to mark the passing of days, without the sight of the sky that allowed following the movement of the sun and stars, time underground would become abstract and difficult to measure. The inhabitants probably maintained a time organization based on the rhythms of meals, sleep, and prayers, but the subjective feeling that time was passing more slowly than usual, that particular heaviness of confined time, must have been a constant presence in underground life. The discovery of the Nevşehir underground complex in 2014 also illustrates how much of the archaeological record of the ancient world remains hidden beneath modern urban development. The cities of Cappadocia are not remote archaeological sites in uninhabited landscapes. They are beneath the streets, houses, and public buildings of communities that have been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. Every major construction project in the region has the potential to reveal new archaeological material, which creates a constant tension between the development needs of living communities and the preservation needs of the buried past they literally live on top of. The comparison between the underground cities of Cappadocia and other forms of ancient refuge architecture around the world reveals both the universality of the impulse to create defensive spaces and the particularity of the Cappadocian solution. Castles and city walls represent the defensive impulse applied to the surface, creating fortified spaces that can resist attack from outside but remain visible and accessible from above. Underground cities represent the opposite strategy. Rather than resisting the attacker from a strong visible position, the defended community makes itself invisible and inaccessible by withdrawing below the surface entirely. That choice between visible resistance and invisible withdrawal reflects different assessments of the relative military capabilities of defenders and attackers, and the choice of underground withdrawal in Cappadocia reflects a realistic understanding of the military balance between small agricultural communities and the large organized armies that attacked them. The acoustic properties of the underground galleries also had particular characteristics that the inhabitants must have known well. In a completely enclosed rock space, sound is not absorbed as in the soft materials of modern constructions, but reflected from the walls, creating reverberations that can be unsettling in large spaces and comforting in small ones. The worship rooms of the underground cities, with their arched ceilings and rock walls, produce a particular acoustics that amplifies and redistributes the sounds of voices and music, creating an effect that the faithful of the Christian communities who use them must have perceived as especially appropriate for prayer and liturgical chant. The ongoing excavation of the Nevşehir complex also raises the question of how to communicate to the general public the provisional and contingent nature of archaeological knowledge. The underground cities are often presented in popular accounts as fully understood, their dimensions and functions established, their history narrated with confidence. The reality is considerably more uncertain. The boundaries of the known systems are not clearly defined, the dating of different phases of construction is often imprecise, and the interpretation of many of the spaces remains contested among specialists. Communicating that uncertainty without undermining the genuine interest and wonder that the sites inspire is one of the persistent challenges of archaeological communication, and the underground cities of Cappadocia, with their combination of spectacular visual impact and genuine scholarly uncertainty, are a particularly good testing ground for approaches to that challenge. The connection between the underground cities and the broader phenomenon of cave art and cave habitation in human prehistory is worth noting, even though the Cappadocian underground cities are far more recent than the painted caves of the Paleolithic. The human relationship with underground spaces is ancient and deep, predating the development of agriculture, writing, and organized society by tens of thousands of years. The cave paintings of the Paleolithic world suggest that underground spaces were not just used as shelters but were understood as liminal spaces, places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the world of the sacred or the supernatural was thinner than it was on the surface. Whether any echo of that ancient understanding of underground space as sacred resonated in the communities that built and used the Cappadocian cities we cannot know, but the possibility adds another layer of meaning to the practice of underground refuge. And yet, generations of people did it. Not as an exceptional and traumatic experience remembered for years, but as a normal and expected part of life in Cappadocia. Going underground when the invaders came, waiting, surfacing when the danger had passed, assessing the damage, rebuilding what had been destroyed on the surface, and beginning again to prepare for the next time. That cycle of vulnerability and refuge, of surface and interior, of fear and waiting, was the rhythm of life of countless generations of Cappadocian inhabitants for more than 1,000 years. The underground cities of Cappadocia also have something to say about the nature of home and about what human beings need to feel safe. For the inhabitants of ancient Cappadocia, home was not a fixed place but a two-level system. The surface, where ordinary life unfolded, agriculture, trade, social relations, religious life in the rock-cut churches carved into the tuff cones that characterized the landscape of the region, and the subsurface, where emergency life unfolded, the refuge when the surface became inaccessible. Both levels were part of the same concept of home, and the knowledge that the second level existed, that in case of need there was a safe place underground where the community could survive, must have provided a particular form of psychological security that partially compensated for the vulnerability of living in one of the most contested regions of the ancient world. The political implications of the underground cities in the Byzantine period were also significant. A village community that possessed a functioning underground city was a community that could not easily be displaced by military force alone. It had a place to go when attacked, a place where it could wait out the pressure and then return to its surface territory. That defensive capacity gave the communities of Cappadocia a degree of political autonomy and resilience that other communities in the Byzantine frontier zone lacked, and it may have contributed to the relative stability of the Cappadocian population across the turbulent centuries of Arab raids. Communities that can survive raids without catastrophic loss of life and property are communities that can maintain their social organization and eventually resume their productive activities, unlike communities that are swept away entirely by successful raids. The cultural heritage of that resilience can be read in the landscape of modern Cappadocia. The underground cities coexist on the surface with the rock-cut churches, the castles, and the villages that the communities built in the relatively peaceful periods between invasions. The landscape as a whole is the testimony of a civilization that learned to live in two dimensions simultaneously, adapting its survival strategies to the conditions of each moment without losing the cultural continuity that defined it. The underground cities of Cappadocia also provide a rare example of what archaeologists call living archaeology, the study of spaces that were used continuously over very long periods by communities that adapted them to changing needs. Unlike a city that was suddenly abandoned and preserved in a snapshot of a single moment, Derinkuyu shows layers of modification accumulated over more than 2,000 years of active use. Earlier chambers were repurposed, passages were widened or narrowed, ventilation shafts were rerouted, religious spaces were added and modified as the faith of the communities changed. Reading those layers of modification is like reading a palimpsest, a manuscript written over and over again on the same surface, each layer partially obscuring but not entirely erasing the ones beneath. The silence and darkness that characterize the deepest levels of Derinkuyu today have a contemplative quality that modern visitors often remark upon even after a brief visit. That quality of silence and darkness, which would have been experienced as oppressive during a period of anxious refuge, takes on a different character when experienced without the pressure of immediate danger. It is the silence of deep time, the stillness of spaces that have been carved into the rock for more than 2,000 years and that have witnessed the full sweep of the human drama of the region in that time. Sitting quietly in one of those deep chambers, it is possible to imagine the generations of people who sat in the same spaces, lit by the same quality of lamplight, waiting for the same transition from danger to safety that is the essential rhythm of the underground city experience. The psychologists who study human behavior in confined spaces, from spelunkers who spend months underground to astronauts in space stations, have documented the effects that prolonged confinement produces on the mental and emotional state of human beings. Deprivation of natural light disrupts circadian rhythms and can produce depression. Lack of privacy in crowded spaces generates social tension and conflicts. Uncertainty about when the confinement will end is a source of anxiety that can be more debilitating than the confinement itself. And yet, human groups that experience confinement together, especially when that confinement is motivated by a common external threat, also develop extraordinarily strong bonds of solidarity and social cohesion. The shared experience of underground refuge must have created among its participants a particular type of community, forged in darkness and shared fear. The underground cities of Cappadocia also raise questions about the cultural transmission of knowledge across generations. The underground cities also provide a humbling perspective on the relationship between technological sophistication and survival. The builders of Derinquiu had no computers, no power tools, no advanced materials science, no formal engineering training. What they had was accumulated practical knowledge, the ability to observe and learn from experience, the capacity for sustained collective effort over long periods, and the motivation provided by the very real danger that made underground refuge a necessity rather than a luxury. Those resources, which are available to any human community regardless of its level of technological development, were sufficient to create structures of extraordinary engineering sophistication that have survived in usable condition for more than 2,000 years. The underground cities are a reminder that technological sophistication is not the only path to impressive material achievement, and that the human capacity for practical problem-solving is an ancient and reliable resource. The communities that built and used the underground cities were not passive victims of history, swept along by forces they could not control. They were communities that actively responded to the conditions of their environment, that invested labor and resources in practical solutions to the problems they faced, and that transmitted that knowledge and those solutions to their children and grandchildren. Their response to vulnerability was not abandonment or resignation, but engineering. And that response worked. Cappadocia survived millennia of invasions and instability, and its inhabitants continued living in the region and maintaining their communities alive through all those historical storms. What the underground cities of Cappadocia demonstrate, more than anything else, is the human capacity for transgenerational planning. No individual, nor any single generation, built Derinquiu. What each generation did was add its contribution to a project it inherited from its predecessors and knew it would transmit to its successors. That willingness to invest labor and resources in structures that one will not oneself see completed, but from which children and grandchildren will benefit, is one of the most distinctively human characteristics that exist. The medieval cathedrals are the best-known example of that type of project. The underground cities of Cappadocia are another, less famous but equally impressive, and in many ways more ancient. The underground cities of Cappadocia also have a literary dimension worth mentioning. Over the centuries, the existence of cities hidden beneath the earth has fed popular imagination and generated local legends of all kinds. Cities of hidden treasure, refuges of supernatural creatures, entrances to the world of the dead. In the oral tradition of Cappadocian communities, the underground cities occupied an ambiguous place, simultaneously familiar and mysterious, everyday in their function as refuge and extraordinary in their scale and antiquity. That ambiguity between the practical and the marvelous is precisely what makes the underground cities continue to capture the imagination of people who visit them or read about them, centuries after they ceased to be used for the purpose that created them. The modern experience of visiting the underground cities of Cappadocia is shaped by factors that the original inhabitants would have found incomprehensible. The electric lighting that reveals the full extent of the carved spaces, the clearly marked tourist routes that prevent visitors from getting lost, the audio guides that provide historical context in multiple languages, the regulated flow of visitors that prevents overcrowding. Those modern interventions make the cities accessible and comprehensible to millions of people who could not otherwise experience them, but they also change the phenomenological character of the spaces in fundamental ways. The darkness that was the defining condition of underground life has been replaced by light. The orientation challenge that made underground navigation a specialized skill has been replaced by clearly marked routes. The experience of archaeological tourism in the underground cities of Cappadocia is a mediated experience, valuable and important but fundamentally different from the experience it is designed to evoke. The study of microbial communities in the underground cities has also opened unexpected windows onto their history. The bacteria and fungi that currently inhabit the walls and floors of the underground galleries are not random colonizers, but the descendants of communities that have been evolving in those specific environments for as long as the cities have existed. Some of those microbial communities show adaptations to the specific chemical environment of the carved tuff, including the ability to extract minerals from the rock surface that are not available in ordinary soil. Studying those microbial communities can potentially yield information about the history of the spaces they inhabit, including changes in humidity, temperature, and human use patterns that are recorded in the genetic diversity of the microbial populations. The underground cities are also a reminder of the extraordinary diversity of solutions that human beings have devised in response to common problems. Every culture, in every part of the world, has faced the problem of how to protect its members against violence and natural disaster. The solutions range from fortified hilltop settlements to island communities, from nomadic mobility to subterranean cities, from sophisticated diplomatic systems designed to prevent conflict to elaborate ritual systems designed to manage its aftermath. The underground cities of Cappadocia are one of the most dramatic of those solutions, and they derive their drama precisely from the extremity of the challenge to which they respond. Not how to make conflict less likely, but how to survive it when it comes, for as long as necessary, without losing the community that makes survival worth having. The role of women and children in the life of the underground cities is an aspect that archaeology can only illuminate indirectly. The rooms interpreted as schools or places of instruction suggest that the confinement period was not understood simply as passive waiting time, but as an opportunity for education. Children growing up in communities that regularly use the underground cities must have learned from a young age how to function in that environment, inheriting from their parents not just the physical structures but the entire body of practical knowledge needed to live in them safely and efficiently. That transmission of embodied knowledge, from parent to child across dozens of generations, is one of the most human aspects of the underground city story. The last documented references to the use of the underground cities as refuge date from the early 20th century, during the conflicts that accompanied the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the founding of the Republic of Turkey. In those turbulent years, local populations returned to using the tunnels of their ancestors for protection, exactly as their predecessors had done for millennia. That continuity of response across thousands of years of changing circumstances is one of the most remarkable aspects of the underground city tradition. Tonight, as you contemplate the darkness of your room before falling asleep, you can think of the people who for millennia contemplated the darkness of their underground cities, waiting for the danger to pass. The acoustic isolation of the underground cities from the surface world above was another of their defensive advantages that is easy to overlook. An army searching for underground refuges on the surface would be unable to hear any sounds from below, while the inhabitants underground would similarly be unable to hear what was happening on the surface, relying instead on scouts who could observe through the small openings of the ventilation shafts or on the sounds that filtered through those shafts. That mutual acoustic isolation meant that the underground inhabitants could speak, move, and conduct their daily activities at normal volume without fear of being detected by the forces above, a significant psychological relief in a situation where the need to maintain absolute silence would have added enormously to the stress of confinement. In that act of waiting there was a combination of fear and trust that is profoundly human. Fear of the enemy that might be moving across the surface above their heads, searching for the entrances to their refuges. And trust in the rock that surrounded them, in the ventilation system that their ancestors had designed with such care, in the circular stones that sealed the entrances, in the community that accompanied them in the darkness. That combination of fear and trust in the structures that protected them is not so different from what any person experiences when closing the door of their home at night and surrendering to sleep. The underground cities of Cappadocia continue to be explored, continue to reveal secrets. The Nevşehir complex, discovered in 2014, has not yet been completely excavated. There are dozens more smaller underground cities in the region that have never been studied in detail. And according to archaeologists working in the area, geophysical surveys suggest that beneath the soil of Cappadocia there are underground structures that have not yet been discovered even accidentally. The underground project of Cappadocia, which began more than 4,000 years ago, continues to deliver its secrets slowly, at its own pace, indifferent to the impatience of archaeologists and the curious. The global phenomenon of underground architecture across human history reflects something fundamental about the relationship between human beings and the ground beneath them. From the cave dwellings of the earliest modern humans to the modern underground bunkers built during the Cold War, the impulse to go beneath the surface when the surface becomes dangerous is one of the most consistent threads in human behavioral history. The underground cities of Cappadocia are the most elaborate expression of that impulse that archaeology has yet revealed, but they are part of a much longer and broader story about the human relationship with the earth, a relationship that is at once practical and symbolic, shaped by both fear and by the deep mammalian instinct for burrowing into the safety of the ground. The final descent into the deepest level of Derinkuyu, where the archaeologists have identified what may be a school or community gathering space, invites reflection on what the communities of Cappadocia chose to preserve and transmit to the next generation even in the most extreme circumstances. Not just food, not just animals, not just the physical objects needed for material survival, but the intangible goods of education, community organization, and shared meaning. The presence of a space designated for learning in the deepest and most secure part of the underground city suggests that the communities who built and used Derinkuyu understood that the continuity of their way of life depended not just on the survival of its members, but on the transmission of the knowledge and values that gave that life its particular character. That understanding, expressed in stone more than 2,000 years ago, resonates across all the distance of time. Derinkuyu was discovered accidentally in 1963, when an inhabitant of the village of the same name found an unknown room behind a wall of his house. Since then, more than 60 years of systematic excavations have revealed a city of a scale and complexity that first discoverer could not have imagined. And the archaeologists who work in the region are certain that the next 60 years will reveal equally surprising things. The underground cities of Cappadocia are a reminder that the history of human beings is much richer, more complex, and more surprising than any history book can capture. Most of what human beings have built, thought, suffered, and celebrated across the millennia has left few traces in the historical record. The underground cities are one of those rare exceptions, physical monuments to the experience of communities that would otherwise have remained completely invisible to us, carved into the rock with a permanence that written documents rarely achieve. The impact of climate change on the preservation of the underground cities is an emerging concern among conservation scientists. Changes in precipitation patterns in the Cappadocia region could affect the hydrology of the underground system, potentially increasing the flow of water through the rock and accelerating the dissolution of the tuff that forms the walls, floors, and ceilings of the underground chambers. Changes in temperature could also affect the delicate microclimate of the cities, potentially altering the conditions that have preserved organic materials, pigments, and carved surfaces in their current condition. The underground cities have survived for more than 2,000 years under relatively stable climatic conditions. Whether they will survive the changes that the coming centuries may bring is an open question that conservation scientists are only beginning to systematically address. The silence of the galleries of Derinkuyu, when the tourists have departed and the guards have closed the entrances for the night, is the same silence that the inhabitants of the city heard 2,000 years ago, waiting in the darkness for the danger to pass. It is the silence of stone and of time, of patience and of hope. It is the silence that precedes sleep, when the mind releases the urgencies of the day and surrenders to that other refuge that all human beings know. Sleep, rest, the renewal that comes with each night. Let that silence accompany you now. The cities beneath the earth have waited thousands of years to be found. Your concerns can wait until tomorrow. The underground cities of Cappadocia will continue to reveal their secrets for as long as archaeologists study them and geological processes expose new sections of the vast network of tunnels and chambers beneath the surface. Each generation of researchers brings new questions, new methods, and new frameworks of understanding to these extraordinary sites, and each generation finds something that the previous generation had not seen or had seen but not understood. That ongoing dialogue between the present and the past, between the living researchers and the long-dead builders, is what makes archaeology one of the most human of all intellectual disciplines. It is the sustained attempt to recover and honor the experience of people who cannot speak for themselves, working through the medium of the objects and spaces they left behind. The underground cities of Cappadocia are also a reminder of how much of human history has been shaped by geography. The particular combination of easily workable volcanic rock and a strategic location at the crossroads of major ancient trade and military routes created the specific conditions that made the underground cities both possible and necessary. A community with the same cultural values and technical capabilities but living in a landscape of hard granite would not have been able to create anything comparable. And a community living in the same soft tuff but in a more geopolitically peripheral location might not have had sufficient motivation to invest in such extensive underground infrastructure. The underground cities are the product of a unique intersection of geology, geography, and historical circumstances that is unlikely to have been replicated exactly anywhere else on Earth. The underground cities of Cappadocia are not simply historical curiosities preserved for the benefit of tourists and scholars. They are living evidence of a form of human determination that transcends any particular culture or era. The determination to persist, to protect what matters, and to pass it on to the next generation even in the most hostile circumstances. Every carved wall in Derinkuyu is evidence of that determination, repeated in the movement of every tool stroke, accumulated across generations of labor and care. The world is full of evidence of human achievement in favorable conditions. The underground cities are evidence of something rarer and in many ways more admirable, achievement in the face of sustained adversity, chosen not for glory but for survival. Tonight the cities beneath Cappadocia are quiet. Their passages hold the cool air they have always held. Their ceiling stones rest in their tracks. And above them, the landscape of pale rock formation stands in the moonlight as it has for millions of years, indifferent and enduring. Somewhere beneath that landscape, there are passages and chambers that no archaeologist has yet entered, no tourist has yet photographed, no researcher has yet mapped. They are waiting, as the entire underground world of Cappadocia has always waited, with the patience of stone and time. And in that patient waiting, they offer us a kind of company in the darkness, the knowledge that others have waited here before us, and that the waiting always ends. If this journey kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are many more worlds waiting to be explored in the dark. The experience of the underground cities also has something to teach us about the relationship between constraint and creativity. The communities that built Derinkuyu were operating under severe constraints: limited tools, limited materials, limited time, and the pressing need to create a functional refuge before the next raid season began. Those constraints did not prevent creative engineering solutions, but in many ways drove them. The ventilation system, the sealing stone mechanism, the distribution of water sources. All of these were solutions to specific problems generated by the constraints of underground construction and underground habitation. Constraint, as engineers and designers in every era have discovered, is often the mother of innovation. The stories that the underground cities inspired in the communities that used them are now largely lost, but their absence is itself informative. In most cultures, places of refuge from violence take on a mythological significance that persists long after the threat that created them has passed. The fact that the underground cities of Cappadocia generated relatively little preserved mythology compared with their evident importance in the lives of the communities that depended on them may reflect the fact that they were too ordinary, too much a part of everyday life, to require mythological elaboration. Places that are used regularly and practically tend not to become the subjects of legend in the same way as places that are encountered only in exceptional circumstances. The underground cities may have been too normal to be remarkable, at least to the communities that built and used them. The underground cities of Cappadocia will be studied, visited, and wondered at for as long as human beings maintain their interest in the long arc of their own history. They represent something essential about that history: the capacity of communities under extreme pressure to create solutions of lasting beauty and functionality, to transmit those solutions across generations, and to maintain their cultural identity through centuries of violence and instability. That capacity, which is as visible in the carved walls of Derinkuyu as in the great temples and palaces of the ancient world, is one of the most fundamentally human characteristics we know. And it is one that deserves to be celebrated, understood, and passed on to the generations who will inherit these extraordinary underground spaces. The discovery and systematic study of the underground cities also has implications for how we understand the relationship between ancient communities and the landscapes they inhabited. The conventional archaeological picture of ancient settlement, focused primarily on surface structures, may systematically underestimate the degree to which ancient communities exploited the subsurface of their landscapes for storage, refuge, and other purposes. If the underground cities of Cappadocia are exceptional in scale but not in principle, then there may be many other regions of the world where significant underground infrastructure remains to be discovered beneath what appears to be a purely surface-level archaeological record. The lessons of Cappadocia suggest that a complete picture of ancient land use requires not just surface survey and excavation, but also systematic subsurface investigation. The silence that greets you at the deepest level of an underground city is a silence that has accumulated over thousands of years. It is the silence of countless generations of people who waited in that same darkness, who breathed that same cool air, who felt the same weight of rock above them and drew from it the same paradoxical comfort of enclosure and protection. When you close your eyes tonight and let the concerns of the day recede, you are performing a version of the same gesture that those long-ago communities performed when they sealed the stone doors of their underground refuge and surrendered to the waiting. The darkness is not a threat but a shelter. The quiet is not emptiness but the accumulated presence of all the lives that have sought rest in it before yours.